My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I just continue to realize that I just rip off the intro from Weightlifting House, and old habits die hard, I guess. But without further ado, as you have already figured out by the title of the show, we have on good buddy, longtime buddy, friend, Zach Robinson, and his, I guess, business partner, Josh Pelland, the guys from Data Driven Strength. So I'll do the honorary. How's it going, fellas?
Going well, dude.
Going well over here as well. Thanks for having us on, Josh.
Yeah, as always, very sophisticated answers to a sophisticated question. I guess for people who are unfamiliar, and you have to, like, listening to this podcast, you have to be in this weird space of weightlifting, and then also to be interested in seeing the title, which might be like long-term planning, short-term planning, data-driven strength, whatever it is. You have to be even more down the rabbit hole of sports science, weightlifting, powerlifting. And for people who, aren't down that rabbit hole and are a bit unfamiliar with what you guys do as a company, maybe you can introduce yourselves, introduce data-driven strength, and kind of give your elevator pitch to why you guys are class coaches.
Go for it, Josh.
Yeah, so I guess we do more or less try to do some science communication related to strength and hypertrophy training. I mean, our niche is more in powerlifting specific training, but we also enjoy coaching individuals that have just general strength goals as well as, primarily physique goals. But something we always try to do with any science communication is make it very practical. So that's kind of the spin we like to take on things, is making things as practical as possible. I'm kind of forgetting what the original question was, but that's kind of an overview of what we do. I mean, we all have athletes that we coach one-on-one, mm-hmm. and then beyond that, just trying to do writing and other forms of science communication.
Mm-hmm. Didn't even plug our sweet podcast, Josh.
Yeah, man. 5 episodes in, I guess we can start talking about that.
But yeah, I guess Josh hit on most of the things kind of we do, just globally as a company. But Josh and I, just kind of our general background, both went to Ohio State, did our undergrad there in exercise science, met one another, got involved in research there, and kind of found our love for combining the two spheres of academia and also the practical sphere, just liking to lift weights and reading how to get better at lifting weights. Mm-hmm. And so now we're both doing our masters at FAU, looking to continue to kind of sharpen our tool set as far as digesting research, and like Josh said, using that tool set to primarily turn what can be a complicated language of limitations and understanding how best to answer a question and communicate that to the average lifter that can just take away the practical nuggets and know how they can get bigger, stronger, and more powerful in the weightlifting case.
Yeah. Zach, just don't refer to my listeners as average. We're savage. We're not average. So
I apologize. I'm referring to myself.
Hey man, you're kind of strong. Or
what a compliment.
I guess a younger guy. Anyways, yeah, I think that's awesome. I think what you guys do is really cool, because what I see, and this is just kind of in that general, I guess, circle of people in like powerlifting and weightlifting, is there is a deep interest in I always hate to talk about science as like this esoteric concept, but there's like a deeper interest in the science and in the underlying kind of mechanisms at play when we talk about building muscle and getting stronger and building like the skill of sport whatever it may be. And I think being able to communicate that concisely but accurately is definitely tricky. Not to oversell or undersell, and that's always something you can get caught up in. So I think it's really cool that you guys are doing that and attempting to communicate the information to a wider variety of people who are interested in knowing more and applying it to their own training. This is a question, I guess, the podcast, All Things Strength and Wellness, he tends to ask his guests initially, what are the things that you see are going right with the field of strength and conditioning, powerlifting, training, coaching, and what are the things that are going wrong? And I think for people who are deeply rooted in the field of understanding the background and then understanding the foreground, in that the mechanisms at play and then how they flush out into practice, what are the things that you think are right and are going well within the field of, I hate to keep it specific to powerlifting, but like in strength training or in the realm of like developing strength?
So I'll just jump in really quick because something kind of came to my mind, and then I'll pass it over to you, Zach. Just generally speaking, I think the receptiveness to more evidence-based training methodologies is increasing. And perhaps more importantly, the critical thinking behind training concepts is more and more widespread. So an example of this is our friend James, who's the host of the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. He sent me a repost of one of my posts from some YouTuber that has like a bunch of followers. So this YouTuber that's not necessarily quote unquote evidence based reposted one of my posts, and he sent it to me. And at first I was like, oh, that's cool, but like, that's not really our area. But he's like, dude, this is really cool. Like, think about that. This guy who has like a ton of influence over, these teenagers that are getting into strength training is kind of drawing upon like a study review post, and he's sharing that. Like, that's a really cool step forward. So I think that that's becoming more and more common, and is definitely trending in the right direction. So even though there might not be best practices unanimously in the field, I think everything is moving in the right direction, which is really promising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally echo that. That's a really, really encouraging thing to see. Where my head kind of went was in maybe a little bit more in our kind of niche and not so generally. I think the limits and the bounds of science are starting to be, probably well-defined, and people can understand that. And so it's much less of, I have 17 citations and here's why everything I just said is completely right and there's absolutely no holes in it. And now it's more like, you can share a citation, but at the same time, somebody that can appreciate science and use it to develop best practices, on average, at the same time can acknowledge its limitations and know where anecdote still shines. And I think, that's kind of the next step in the quote unquote evidence-based thing, is being able to use both of those swords at the appropriate time and understanding the blind spots and the limitations of each. And I think that to me has kind of been the progression I've seen. And like, you take the very, very hardcore, people that spend hours on PubMed in their free time, you take those people, and then you take the other people that maybe have never read a study, and they don't really care to. And I think you're starting to see more of a marriage in the middle where you can both respect the advantages and disadvantages of each side of that spectrum. And obviously they're not mutually exclusive, and each of them probably have a time and a place in which they're more useful. And I think just acknowledging that from, obviously we are heavily involved in the research process, so that's kind of where our worldview comes from. But at the same time, we know, being so familiar with it, that there are many limitations, and you can't get to what you should be doing in the gym without relying on some degree of anecdote from successful lifters of the past. So I think understanding that and kind of that relationship between the two, I think has been definitely more fleshed out in the field as of late.
Yeah, just a quick comment. With respect to the degrees of separation, it actually stemmed from someone mentioning a study that took place, and then I heard from one of the researchers or a person involved that like there were a lot of considerations that weren't necessarily talked about in the paper, and then you have to think, okay, well, how useful is this study if there are things that went on behind the scenes that no one else really knows about, but they had to get it published. And I'm just thinking about the information that a lot of people in weightlifting use to dictate their training program, and then also the way they teach the movement in the sense of the technical demands of it. It comes from a lot of Russian research from the 70s, and thinking about the number of translations, the degrees of separation from the coach implementing research on, 700 plus, 800 plus Russian athletes, weightlifters specifically, and then how that applies, and then digging through the degrees of separation from the translated material to the actual material to what did that look like in practice? What was Russia like with respect to the political climate? It's like recognition of that, but on a smaller scale as you get closer and closer to the paper that was just released in 2020 from a very reputable source and a respectable person who can also contextualize it, and then figuring out how that plays into the larger purview of established information, established science. So,
yeah, that's a really good way of framing it, Josh. And I think, Zach kind of touched on, not only understanding what the research would indicate, but also the limitations of that research is just as important. But it's also important to keep in mind that science, the institution of science, is a self-correcting process, right? So those issues with, I'm not super familiar with the Russian stuff you were referring to, but in theory, the institution of science would take care of that over time as more pieces to the puzzle are added.
Yeah, I think that's a great follow-up point. And with that being said, the first part of the question was what's going well, and then the second part would be, what do you see that's wrong with this space of strength coaching and basically the field we're involved in, getting people stronger and better at powerlifting and weightlifting. What do you think is kind of going awry that needs to be self-corrected?
That's a tough one, Josh. Anything come off the top of your head to you?
I mean, sometimes we get memed for, having our low fatigue concepts, and that's our hammer, and then everything looks like a nail, and we have that. So I could riff on that a little bit.
Go for it.
Yeah. So something that we've noticed, especially in the powerlifting community, is, I'm assuming most of the listeners will be familiar with the Rpe scale. Mm-hmm. So, just briefly, a 9 out of 10 RP would indicate you think you have 1 rep in reserve. An 8 out of 10 would be 2 reps in reserve, et cetera. And a lot of people kind of fall into this headspace that a set has to be, around a 6 RPE or above to be a quote unquote productive set, or to count towards your training volume. We've kind of actually flipped that on its head for strength training in particular, and argued that at a given load, the first repetitions of a set might be the most productive. So, in practice, I'm not saying that all of our training is below RP6, or even the majority of it is, but we've kind of, opened the door for, hey, our sets with 6 to 10 reps in reserve. So, an RP 0 to 4, are those productive sets, and do those supply some benefit in the overall training structure? So that's something that we're kind of trying to come in and change the rhetoric on, is proximity to failure. And, there's kind of 2 parts of that. Is, first of all, is your RP 6 to 7 out of 10 actually a true 3 to 4 reps in reserve? That's something, we see some practical issues with, of people overrating their RPEs, especially with lighter loads, and being farther from failure, as well as, hey, a true 5 reps in reserve, a true 6 reps in reserve. First of all, that's a hard set. Second of all, that might be a productive set, and again, have some benefits in terms of the overall training plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I concur with that. Josh, you got anything to add on that?
No, I think, I feel like there tends to be that accusation that, low RP gurus or something, like that's all they do. That's all they apply. I mean, it's just one of those situations where you have to look a little bit deeper. And what I found as a weightlifting coach, because it tends to be a bit different than powerlifting, because it's more hands-on, and I don't know if it's the skill demands or the skill requirements of executing a good lift, and maybe the variation between lifts. So it's like you miss one because it's some sort of technical problem versus you just didn't have it in the tank that day. Weightlifting coaches tend to be more hands-on. They tend to be more adjustable, and on the fly, there tends to be more coaching and more of that self-correction that is at play. And I'd be interested to hear, in person, what you guys do. If you had an athlete in front of you and you're working with them one-on-one, how would that look different from these protocols that tend to be kind of not necessarily parroted, but passed around or programmed and then implemented in a remote space where you can see the difference in RPE ratings. You can see the difference in, how that training might flush out versus how it's meant to be executed. Are there any like considerations there that you can maybe clear up?
Yeah, I think that's a huge one in the example of the low fatigue stuff that Josh was talking about. If I was able to train a lot of my clients in person, I think the first mission would be to get them really, really familiar with what a true 2 RAR set feels like, because everything else is kind of anchored off of that. Like proximity to failure is anchored, 0 RAR means something. And if your 0 RAR isn't meaning in the gym what I'm intending when I write the program, then kind of the entire, spectrum of the RP ranges are all going to mean something that I'm not intending. So I think that would be probably the main thing in person, that like, somebody does a set, they rate it at an 8 RPE, and it's like, hold on, let's get back on the leg press real quick and let's take that to failure real quick and realize that, oh, I'm actually 13 reps from failure when I called it, a 2 RAR because it was a high rep leg press and my legs were burning really bad. But in reality, I still could have kept pushing considerably more. And so that often paints the picture when we say you can train with, more than 4 reps in reserve and maximize strength and still have a very productive hypertrophy stimulus. People are like, you're insane, dude. How are you saying we can train that easy and make meaningful adaptations? And I just like sit and think to myself, is like, I would very, very much like to know what your 2 RAR sets look like, just as an anchor. Because when I hear 5 RAR, it's like, yeah, that's definitely an easier set, but those are still really, really difficult. Like, especially at a heavy enough load. Like a lot of the research that we have would suggest that people are pretty inaccurate with RPE, which I think anybody that's used it in a practical setting wouldn't be surprised by that. And, usually people are off somewhere between 2 to 4 reps off of whatever they're rating the set. So like when people are calling it 8 RPE, which is what in their terminology, they would call that a difficult set, that's more like what I'm calling a 5 RAR. So it's like they're kind of talking about the same thing, but just because we're communicating it, trying to anchor it as best we can to actual concentric failure, I think that often gets lost in the weeds a little bit. And I think that process could be largely mitigated if you were able to train with someone in person. So you could really, from week 1 or 2 in a cycle, you can say, oh, no, this is what I mean by RPE8. And so that when we get into like this lower fatigue strength phase where we're cutting the reps per set to try to minimize some of that intraset fatigue, then those sets will still be difficult, but they're just considerably farther from failure than what you would have been doing in maybe a more hypertrophy focused block. But yeah, that's kind of where my head went.
Yeah. And then I mentioned at the outset the focus of this podcast, and obviously we're going to break it into 2 parts just due to time constraints and life, I guess. But zooming out, right, taking a glimpse at an annual plan, so a periodized plan where there's a change in the focus from block to block. It could be like small or large, depending on the sport. How does I guess we can kind of single in on RPE or reps in reserve, using that as kind of the RPE scale. How does that change from, say, the furthest out from competition? What does a training plan look like? And then also, I guess we could almost just do this same kind of concept with each training block. What do most people get wrong in the block furthest out from competition? And what should they be looking to achieve, to have not only productive training in the week, in the day, in the month, but in the year, right?
So this is definitely where our kind of muscle-centric bias to training comes in. We are very much of the opinion. I mean, it's evidence-led our opinion is that your best investment for long-term strength progress is to accrue muscle mass. So to directly answer your question of what do people get wrong farthest out from training, or farthest out from competition, our answer to that would be not optimizing training variables to accrue muscle mass in the most efficient way possible. And, I don't know if you want to dive into the training variables and how we adjust those, but in short, obviously we're still having the individual maintain their skill with the competition lifts, and continue to move forward in that department, but really setting things up so that muscle mass can be accrued efficiently, and almost getting them to train like a bodybuilder in some ways is one of the first changes we make, and that's especially apparent when far out from competition.
Yeah, just to chime in on that just a little bit extra, I think the one of the things Josh said in there is really, really important too, that often goes maybe a little bit misconstrued. Like in typical periodized models, especially older ones, like when you're doing a quote unquote hypertrophy phase or a work capacity phase or an accumulation phase, whatever terminology you want to use, those top sets or skill sets or any type of higher intensity exposure you're using to maintain your skill on the 1RM type movements. I think that's really, really important to include for a majority of the time, because, people will say, yeah, that whole periodization hypertrophy thing didn't really work for me. And I understand where they're coming from, and there could be some validity to kind of what they're describing, but I think a lot of times it's because all they did was sets of 8 to 12, and they did absolutely nothing in terms of top end strength work to maintain their skill. So when they go into the next block in which they're trying to, again, depending on what terminology you want to use, like transmutate that muscle size into strength gains, you have to regain a ton of lost ground if you have not been practicing any strength skill at all. And so I think a lot of times it's like, well, this didn't really seem to work. And in reality, it's just going to take some time for you to regain all that skill to demonstrate that strength, which I think that's just a really important thing to consider that, could be gotten wrong if you don't have any type of exposure to heavy loads. Now that can come in a ton of different shapes and sizes. You can go from a set of 5 at a 9 RP all the way down to like a single at a 5 RP. You can be tons of different organizations there, but I think at least having something close to the test that you're trying to ultimately train for, I think is pretty important too, even in those farther blocks far out from competition.
Yeah, and I chuckled because, just hearing someone say, hypertrophy doesn't work for me, it's kind of funny. It's like someone saying, squatting doesn't work for me. It's like, well, maybe you're just not squatting correctly. Yeah, I get that. And when we talk about block models or like block periodized models, what's interesting is we always talk about having some sort of concentrated load or a good majority of training dedicated to developing one quality. And then you people, they talk about having sprint loads or maintenance loads. It's enough of the training dedicated to another quality that you can maintain. And in this case, as we've spoken about and seen time and time again, you can even improve. And I've seen people hit big lifts in the middle of the highest volume blocks, and you can say I'm not doing enough volume work or enough hypertrophy specific work or whatever, but I don't think that matters. But I think that's what people leave out. It tends to be black and white. It tends to be, and maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just mischaracterizing it or singling in on a single school of thought. But you see like 5 sets of 10 across the board in every exercise, versus having a retention load of maybe we work up to a top triple, and over time that chips away to a top single, and the back off sets are 5 to 10 reps, 6 to 10 reps, and we accumulate work. So it's presenting it not so much as a dichotomy of strength, endurance, hypertrophy, and then to strength, and then to speed and power, but more so as a focus that kind of evolves over time. Do you guys tend to label this as some sort of concurrent training, or would you say that it is like a block, like a purely block periodized model, just utilizing like, and this is purely semantic, but utilizing like a retention load?
That first of all, what you said there, Josh, was very well said. I definitely agree. But to answer your question, I would probably frame it more as a quote unquote concurrent model as opposed to a block model, again, it's more semantics than anything. But just anecdotally, and I'm sure Zach would agree with this, based on the way we kind of design macro cycles, we often see individuals have better outcomes, better top end strength outcomes in the hypertrophy phase. A lot of times that's because they're kind of getting like noob hypertrophy gains because they've never really actually trained, some of these quote unquote hypertrophy variations hard and actually emphasize them. So, and I've come across individuals that, okay, we kind of have our hypertrophy focused phase followed by a strength focused phase. And we consistently see better rates of top end strength gain in the hypertrophy phase, because again, we're still doing top sets. I have multiple athletes that on bench, they're still doing 5 singles a week because that's what they need to maintain skill and to improve skill. And most importantly, it doesn't wipe them out for the coming hypertrophy work that is probably more important. So I definitely say it's concurrent, and oftentimes individuals get very strong during those phases. And another inherent advantage of, kind of varying the stimulus like this is you're inherently exposing the individual to different combinations of training variables across the macro cycle. And then you can look back, take a bird's eye view and say, okay, where did we get the best rate of gain? And then we can test and retest that and say, okay, was this, this phase in isolation, or was it these two phases in combination? And you can just look at the response, test and retest, and go from there. So you're kind of getting this exposure, and you're able to analyze what might work best for that individual, because we also know that quote unquote traditional strength training, even if you do want to run that year round, may not work best for all individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I largely agree.
Yeah. And then I guess follow-up questions would be, with respect to exercise selection, is it, again, kind of looking at, optimizing? And when I say optimizing, it's just like within the given options, you're picking the best option. So you're optimizing your training by picking the best combination of variables that you kind of have come up with to make progress. I don't mean it in the sense of like perfection, or this is like the best thing. But with respect to optimizing training variables, and I understand we have like 2 minutes, so maybe one of you guys can just answer this, and then we can hold off for the next show to kind of start digging in a little deeper. But when it comes to exercise selection, is that kind of the same idea? That's when you start to play around with different stances, different bars, different I don't know what else you guys do. You're obviously more into the raw powerlifting realm, so it's not like box heights or band tension, but do you play around with different movements and then different like collections of movements to see where the best training effect lies? And then also if it tends to have more transference, or if it's just been so long since they've done it that you get kind of like, again, like they're more sensitized. So it's like a newbie response to the movement. And then that dictates like future training blocks, strength block, peaking block, etc.
Yeah, I think the kind of 2 ways that we kind of look at this, I think first and foremost, especially far from competition, we're trying to find, we just call it a hypertrophy slot that fits the individual's leverages and, just the way that they personally have a mind-muscle connection with the exercise as well as possible. And I think we probably spend more time. That might be one thing we've changed kind of over time, is we probably spend more time trying to figure that out than maybe gets a lot of credit sometimes. So like, you pick a belt squat, but depending on how you perform that belt squat and depending on the individual, leverages and everything, they may or may not have a really strong mind-muscle connection with their quads. Mind-muscle connection isn't necessarily everything, but we do think that having, one of those movements that really does a good job at hammering muscle growth on those prime movers, I think is really, really important. So we kind of do that with all 3 of the competition lifts and try to find variations that individual really, really enjoys and gets a good muscle feel with. And then the other half of it is, like you kind of mentioned, Josh, is like playing around with different, what we just call skill variants, to try to find. So there's a couple of reasons why I like to do that. The general benefits of variation to motor learning is obviously part of it, but I think psychological separation between training slots is also really beneficial, especially for people that are a little bit more neurotic and compare performance from Monday to Wednesday and don't want to be, looking back at their training log like, I'm 10 pounds weaker or whatever. So I think variation is helpful in that regard. And then also just trying to find different tools to fix, I say that in quotes, whatever technical, technical things that we think might help. I think we still identify with the self-organization kind of ideas behind that, in the sense that the lifter is going to self-organize in a way that eventually will be most efficient for them. And we just kind of push that process in a different direction and kind of have some trial and error to see, does our intuition of what will be more efficient actually feel good for them, or does it not? Does it actually result in performance increase? Does it not? Those kind of things. So I think from that aspect, that's kind of what we're looking to accomplish. But yes, those changes are things that we still periodize in terms of probably get a little bit more specific towards competition, but it's still concurrent in nature, in the sense that we still try to keep at least some work in kind of both those areas, the skill slots and the hypertrophy slots, essentially throughout the entire cycle. The protocols are just different depending on kind of what phase of training we're in. But yeah, that's kind of a general overview, man.
Yeah, and we'll dig into, fleshing out the rest of the hypertrophy talk and kind of how that sequences into, developing strength and then developing the actual competition movements in our next episode of the podcast. So guys, where can they follow you if this little teaser tended to whet their appetite about data-driven strength and understanding more about the process you guys use to develop athletes?
Oh man. So on Instagram, you can find us at Data-Driven Strength would be our team page. And then Josh and I are also found there at Zach.Data-Driven Strength and Josh.Data-Driven Strength. That's probably where you can find us most. We post some informational content there, as well as some of our own mediocre lifting. But the team page is where you can find a lot of our clients' progress, which is pretty cool to check out. And then we also just started a podcast recently, Data-Driven Strength Podcast, on most podcasting platforms. We are definitely not as polished as Mr. Gibson here, but we are making our way to try to be less and less mediocre and then take a run at Joe Rogan eventually. But for now, then we also have a YouTube channel, Data-Driven Strength there. You can check out some of our podcasts on there as well. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Best of luck with that. I think it's going to require a lot of DMT and eccentric guests.
A lot of talk about chimps.
Exactly. Thanks, guys, for joining me. For everyone listening, rate the podcast. Go follow me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.